There is something particular about the atmosphere around a World Cup city in the weeks before a tournament begins. You know the feeling if you've ever been close to one. The flags appearing in windows, the additional signage going up around stadiums, the quiet sense that something enormous is arriving and that the city has prepared for it. That readiness is part of what makes the experience. It signals to visiting supporters from around the world that they are welcome, that the city knows what it's doing, that the months of planning are about to pay off. That atmosphere of confident preparation is what every host city aims for, and it's what several of the 11 American host cities have struggled to project ahead of this summer's tournament. Because behind the promotional material and the official statements, a series of funding disputes, planning failures, and logistical shortcomings have played out in public across multiple cities over recent months. Fan festivals have been canceled or dramatically reduced. Security funding has arrived late or not at all. A small town outside Boston nearly withheld the very entertainment license that would have allowed World Cup matches to take place in its stadium. Miami's chief of operations testified to Congress that without federal money, the consequences could be catastrophic. These are not minor administrative hiccups. They are the kinds of problems that change what supporters actually experience when they arrive, and that raise legitimate questions about how the tournament's off-field dimensions were planned and funded. Let's go through the cities where the clearest difficulties have emerged and try to understand what happened and why. Start with New Jersey, which carries a particular symbolic weight in this tournament. MetLife Stadium in East Rutherford is hosting the final on the 19th of July. The conclusion of the World Cup, the match that will be seen by more people simultaneously than almost any other event in human history, will take place there. And New Jersey had planned to mark the occasion with a fan festival that would run the full length of the tournament, nearly 6 weeks, at Liberty State Park in Jersey City. It was to have been one of the flagship public experiences of the entire event, a space where supporters without match tickets could gather, watch games on large screens, and feel the collective atmosphere of a World Cup taking place on their doorstep. That plan was canceled. The state's governing administration announced it was redirecting its efforts towards smaller, more localized events across the state, allocating $5 million for distributed programming. Refunds were issued to supporters who had already purchased tickets to the Liberty State Park event. $5 million sounds like a reasonable investment, until you consider that staging a fan festival of the kind originally planned can cost close to $1 million per day. The mathematics simply didn't work. Then there is Seattle. The Pacific Northwest city is hosting matches at Lumen Field, a compact, atmospheric venue that many football people regard as one of the best in North America. The fan experience outside the stadium was supposed to match what happens inside it. Officials had planned a 74-acre fan campus that was expected to welcome 500,000 supporters across the tournament. That plan has been reduced to a minimum of 4 much smaller locations scattered across the city. 500,000 supporters at a single site, replaced by a collection of smaller venues with no confirmed central hub? That is not a minor scaling back. It fundamentally changes the nature of the public experience that Seattle had promised. The situation in Miami is perhaps the most serious of all, because it carried the starkest official language. The chief operating officer of Miami's host committee testified before a congressional committee and described the end of March as a drop-dead date for receiving the roughly $70 million in federal funds his city had applied for. He was direct. Without receiving that money, the consequences for planning and coordination could be catastrophic. He was clear that the matches at the stadium itself would take place, but that the fan festivals, the watch parties, and the wider public events expected to bring the city to life around the tournament would be in jeopardy. Catastrophic is a word that people in official positions choose carefully. When the operating chief of a host committee uses it in congressional testimony, it is worth taking seriously. Kansas City was in a similar position. A deputy police chief appeared before the same congressional committee and indicated that coordination problems could affect fan safety across host cities. Kansas City is one of the smaller host cities in terms of population, but its stadium, one of the great American sporting venues, and its reputation for passionate football support made it one of the genuinely exciting additions to the tournament's host list.
The prospect of its preparations being compromised by funding uncertainty was a significant concern for the city and for the supporters expecting to visit.
Then there is the most dramatic episode of the entire pre-tournament period. The situation in Foxborough, Massachusetts, the small town of 18,000 residents that is home to Gillette Stadium and that was scheduled to host 7 World Cup matches on behalf of Boston. Foxborough's governing board refused to issue the entertainment license required for matches to take place at the stadium until the question of who would pay for security was resolved. Board members were direct in their frustration, stating clearly that they would not issue the license without clarity on funding, and that, without a commitment, the matches at the stadium could not proceed. The missing sum was $7.8 million, the town's share of the federal security grant program that had been announced by the administration but not yet distributed. The delay was connected to a partial government shutdown, affecting the department responsible for administering the funds. The Foxborough town manager put it without decoration. If nobody provided the money, there would be no World Cup in Foxborough. Think about that for a moment. 7 matches, including a quarterfinal, all confirmed for one of the tournament's most respected stadiums, and the ability to hold those matches rested for a period on a funding dispute between a small New England town and a federal government in the middle of a shutdown. The situation was eventually resolved. Licenses were granted. The matches will proceed. But the episode left a mark. Not because it ended badly, but because it revealed how close things had come to a genuinely serious problem and how late in the process the resolution arrived. What sits beneath all of these individual city stories is a structural issue that becomes clearer the more you examine it. Hosting a fan festival at a World Cup is not optional for the cities involved. It is a condition of the hosting agreement. FIFA requires host committees to stage these events, and yet FIFA provides no meaningful financial support to fund them. The cost of running a festival of the required scale can reach close to $1 million per day. Host committees are expected to cover those costs without access to the revenue streams, ticketing, media rights, sponsorships that generate the money the tournament actually produces. That financial structure deserves scrutiny. The World Cup is among the most commercially successful sporting events on Earth. FIFA's revenue projections for this tournament run into tens of billions of dollars. And yet, the cities that provide the venues, the streets, the transport infrastructure, and the public safety operations are expected to absorb the costs of mandatory fan events without meaningful contribution from the organization that receives the commercial benefit. When the federal funding that was supposed to bridge that gap arrived late or not at all, the consequences fell directly on the host committees and the local authorities, and ultimately on the supporters who had expected those experiences to be available. Privately, officials involved in planning said the conversation shifted. The central question became no longer about atmosphere, but about return on investment, whether the costs of running a large-scale fan festival could be justified given uncertainty about turnout and the late arrival of promised funding. That shift in framing tells its own story. Fan festivals are not meant to be investment calculations. They are meant to be expressions of a city's welcome. When the economics of running one become the primary consideration, something important has already been lost. The San Francisco Bay Area faced a different version of the same problem. Its situation didn't involve a funding crisis in the same direct way, but the outcome was similar. After the tournament draw, the Bay Area found itself without any of the major nations or marquee matches scheduled for its stadium. Officials began reassessing whether the cost of staging large public events was justified given the profile of the fixtures they were hosting. It's an uncomfortable position for a city that went through the full process of bidding for and hosting the tournament, only to find itself at the edges of its own event. What should be clearly said is that the matches themselves, the football inside the stadiums, will happen. Every fixture is going ahead. The stadiums are ready. The players are arriving. And whatever has gone wrong around the edges of the planning, the football at the center of it will demand attention in the way football at this level always does. But the fan festival problem is not trivial. For many supporters, particularly those traveling from overseas, the fan festival is part of the experience. It's where you go when you don't have a ticket. It's where local supporters gather to watch their country play in a city they live in. It's where the tournament becomes visible and accessible beyond the stadium walls. When those spaces are canceled, reduced, or burdened by ticket charges that have never previously been applied to World Cup fan events, the New York and New Jersey host committee began selling tickets to their fan events at $10 per person, the first time entry charges had ever been applied to a World Cup fan festival. The character of the tournament changes for ordinary supporters in ways that quietly accumulate. There is a historical parallel worth drawing here. The 1994 World Cup in the United States, which this tournament is often compared to, also had its share of logistical complexity. The Americans were learning how to host a global football event for the first time, adapting stadiums designed for American football to accommodate a different sport and a different international audience. And they largely succeeded. The tournament delivered. The atmosphere was extraordinary in many cities. The football was memorable. The lesson seemed to be that logistical challenges, even significant ones, don't necessarily define a tournament. But 1994 had certain advantages that 2026 doesn't. It was a smaller tournament, 32 teams, 52 matches. It took place in a political climate that did not produce international travel anxiety among European supporters. And the gap between what was promised and what was delivered was not, on the whole, as visible as it has been this time. Would this affect you the way you think about what a World Cup host city owes its supporters? It's worth sitting with that question, because the commitment these cities made when they entered the bidding process was not just to build a press center and hand FIFA a set of keys. It was to create a context, a public, accessible, welcoming experience around the football. That commitment becomes difficult to honor when the funding structures underlying it are as fragile as they have proved to be. What remains genuinely unclear as the tournament begins is how much of this will be felt by supporters on the ground. Some of the gaps may close. Cities are adaptive, and people who love football are resourceful. Local bars, parks, public squares, community screens. The World Cup has a way of creating its own informal atmosphere, even when the official infrastructure is incomplete. But that informal atmosphere is not the same as what was planned and promised, and the difference matters.